Welcome to the SaaS AdLab podcast, where we bring to you the stories of SaaS founders, entrepreneurs, and CEOs. My name is Luis. I'm the founder of Fantôm Agency, a digital marketing agency specializing in scaling SaaS companies. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing Carson. He is the CEO over at Mediafly. First of all, thank you so much for being on here today. It's a pleasure having you. And like I said before, I know, people like yourself are super busy, especially during this time of the year where, families getting together, you got to fly places and stuff like that. So appreciate your time on here. And
That was great. Thank you.
To get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit, brief story on like where you came from, how did you get to where you are, and really what did it take to become the CEO of a relatively large company?
Yeah. So that's a long story. I think that usually I do over drinks. But essentially, for lack of, for just kind of brevity here. So I started the company in 2006, originally as a consumer media platform. Actually, it was a podcast platform.
Awesome.
We were one of the largest podcast platforms out there. We powered things like the original Roku podcast applications, all kinds of cool stuff. And we got really fortunate in that enterprises started coming to us through one of our partners, Roku, which you're probably familiar with. And they wanted to leverage essentially the Roku platform in order to distribute content on an enterprise level. We thought that was really interesting, great use case of Mediafly. And so we kind of pivoted into that direction, into the enterprise space. And then what's really interesting is right about then the iPad came out, which is what really instigated the sales teams from wanting to be able to use this sort of thing. And that opened up a whole bunch of other possibilities around sales enablement. So rather than just doing audio and video, the ability to also then start to do, paginated content, right? So our initial customers there were like Goldman Sachs, Becton Dickinson, some really cool companies. And so that really, thrust us into the sales enablement space, which really became kind of its own thing in like kind of, 2014 timeframe. And so from then until now, we've been, exclusively focused on this sales enablement use case. But what's interesting about us is we've never lost that kind of consumer feel to our applications.
And I think we have a little bit to talk about that specific thing that you just mentioned, but we'll wait a little bit for that. But as far as growing the company, right? Like there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast that are either early stage founders or they're looking at starting their own company. So like, what was, the defining moment to actually getting started? And also like, what were some of the hardest things as you grew a business from, nothing essentially?
Yeah. There were lots of hard things, as you know, right? So, I think the original genesis was just kind of one of those like moments where I was like, I think this solution could be useful. Again, it was originally for podcasts, right? But the idea was, how do we aggregate content from the internet and ultimately put it on these new devices that were coming out that were internet enabled, right? So that was kind of the original genesis. And I still remember I had the idea, drew it on a piece of paper, drove home and showed it to my wife. And I was like, I'm quitting my job. We're doing this, right? Putting the mortgage in and everything. So, I think the hardest things, I think the thing I always did well was, I read Jack Welch's book, Straight from the Gut. And I think I had written Built to Last and Good to Great, kind of all right in the same time frame. And it was so clear to me that the first thing I need to do is hire awesome people. So I probably started the company with a little bit more funding than I probably would have been smart. I put the mortgage in and my wife and I were all in, but it allowed me to hire some just unbelievable people that most of them were still with me today, 13 years later. So that's continued to be, I would say, the thing I'm the absolute best at, which is just hiring great people. And then, kind of marrying that up with just, allowing them to kind of do what they do best instead of, riding them now. End of the quarter, I'll ride the salespeople pretty hard, but I think, and then, so I'd say that's been the exciting thing. I think, one of the things I think, every entrepreneur needs to keep in mind, which is just pivoting, right? I'm doing very different things today than I did way back when, and we were absolutely willing to kind of go where the river flowed, right? And I'm having so much more fun with each turn because the people that I'm with are awesome, right? And we continued to make more and more money, and the company kept getting bigger and bigger. So it proved itself out, I guess, in the end.
That's awesome. That's really cool. What about customer acquisition? Like, how has that evolved from when you got started initially to where you're at now, especially given the fact that you've pivoted a little bit, throughout the entire process?
Yeah, I would say it's a thing that we're only just now figuring out. I think what's interesting about us is that because we kind of got pulled into this space, and we got pulled into this space from some really progressive, innovative companies.
Mm-hmm.
So when your first customers are Disney, NBC, Miller Coors, PepsiCo, Goldman Sachs, what I didn't realize at the time was that the market is not thinking like these guys were, right? So I really designed Mediafly around this high-end use case of sales enablement. And then we took a round of funding and then kind of put the gas on sales and marketing. And it was like, the market was not ready for, a technology company to tell big companies how to sell, right? So if they were already thinking in this really innovative way, then great. We were about the only solution out there that could do what they're doing in a cost-effective way. But the masses, the 99% of companies were not there. And so customer acquisition was a real challenge because, in order to find companies like that were raising their hand saying, I'm really innovative, it was hard. So it really took about 2 years to get it right. And ultimately what we ended up doing was acquiring 2 companies, a company called Alinian last year, and this year a company called iPresent, that really allowed us to take some of the big thinking that we saw these companies doing and kind of bring it to the masses, right? And it really came down to 2 things. How do you help companies sell in a more interactive, kind of data-driven way?
Right.
So that was this acquisition last year, allows us to do kind of ROI and total cost of ownership calculators for selling really quickly. And then we just acquired a company called iPresent, which is by far the kind of sexiest, fastest time to value sales enablement solution out there. And so the combination of that now, to answer your question on go to market and kind of customer acquisition, we can now go into any company, whether you've got 1 salesperson or 1,000 salespeople or 10,000 salespeople, and we've got a solution that's so easy and so de-risked. And we can go all the way up to the super high-end Mediafly because we help the biggest in companies with the most vision also do this.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any risks with that as far as diversifying your efforts, right? Because if you've been super, hyper focused on helping really big enterprise companies, do you think there is some risk attached essentially with going after a lot of companies that don't necessarily have, what it takes to use the product essentially?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I would say absolutely, there's definitely risk involved in that. I would say, the big risk would have been if we tried to build this ourselves and spend, 2 years and a lot of engineering resources to do this. I think what was really smart was, or what turned out to be smart in hindsight, was that we acquired a company that already had kind of perfected that self-service model, but for enterprises, right? So we're not a solution that, that typically gets used by tiny sales organizations, but we tend to be a solution that gets used by, in a small way within big companies to get started, right? Or companies that are really on a growth trajectory. And so, although we do have lots of companies that do use this from a relatively small standpoint, we don't run into that risk of kind of 2 different things that actually behave very differently, right? So we've got, the same companies that have 1,000 people on iPresent. It's the same exact solution if you're down to 5 users, right? I think the difference here is that what iPresent does is kind of naturally kind of merge into the what traditionally was Mediafly for that high end. So kind of somewhere around 1,000 pieces of content and 1,000 users, there's a natural place where you'd switch to the kind of enterprise Mediafly solution, right? But what was interesting is we found that most companies want to start small, right? They don't know exactly what they want to get out of sales enablement, and so it's really risky to go out there and buy a big enterprise solution. So instead, now they can say, I got 5 users. I want to start with 5 users and show me that this thing works.
Right.
And then when those guys pull on it, now we can take them all the way.
And it's much easier to scale this, right? And I'm saying that in the fact that obviously, I did a little bit of research on the company beforehand, and being an advertising agency, kind of like looked at what kind of, things you were putting in front of people. And I saw a couple of different ads on LinkedIn that were saying, get 100 days with, or $100 for 100 days for $100. So I'm thinking, that's a lot more appealing to a smaller company, and it's probably the approach that you guys are taking. And you can also scale it way faster than you would any other sort of tactic that you were implementing before to go after these enterprise level companies.
Yeah, right. And I think what's really interesting to me is, from a scale standpoint, is that rather than spending 6 months or 9 months convincing a company to buy us, we now can go in and say, in one phone call, we can get somebody who's interested in sales enablement and get them signed up. They can put their credit card down. They can start using the solution, and we still support them with customer success and all that kind of stuff. And so what it's done is it's taken a sales cycle that used to be really long and compressed it down where now they're growing with us, right? And
Right.
so rather than it taking 6 to 9 months to do add any value to them, we add value instantly. And so it's allowing us to hire an entirely different, type of sales organization to acquire customers. And then our traditional sales folks that were at Mediafly are now really in charge of growing accounts, right? And so, it just the amount of leads that are coming in, the amount of new logos we're able to sign, everything is now scalable.
Mhm.
It's honestly, it was the missing piece that we just, we needed to bring in
Mhm.
this model. And you see lots of companies. I mean, Salesforce, I remember when we were, we were a one-person sales organization, we had salesforce.com, right?
Yeah.
And so I think they're a good example of one where you can buy them small and grow all the way up to, massive
Right.
companies, right? So we're kind of following that same exact model.
Uh,
Not quite freemium like Dropbox or Box, but but
I
close
mean,
enough.
technically, it's $100 for a relatively large company, so it's still
Right.
pretty much free.
It's still pretty much free. Yeah, exactly. And really that's just to show that, if you're willing to put $100 down, what you're doing is you're really starting your relationship with us, right? And
Right,
so
and not just that. So like that's something that we focus a lot on is like the psychological aspect of things, right? And like when you have a freemium model, people tend to either not value it as much because they didn't actually put any sort of money down or anything like that. But in this case, I think it's super important because not only are they putting money down, but they're also getting started with the software, which essentially they're spending time, like doing the thing that they're going to be doing later on and building their assets inside of the platform. So it's easier to just stay once you're there and like you've built something within the system essentially.
yeah, I mean, right. I mean, there's a pride of ownership where once you start to tinker with it yourself,
Hmm.
it's not Mediafly anymore. It's my Mediafly, right? It's my own thing, right? And I think we're actually seeing this now with, we're doing this interesting thing. We launched at Dreamforce last week, where we reached out to, a bunch of companies that were perfect fits for Mediafly. And we said, come to our party, send us content ahead of time, and show up. We will give you an iPad that you can take home, has your app fully loaded. Just shows you how easy it is. If we have the ability to create these things, in a couple days for you,
Yeah.
then it really is this easy. And so we actually had, by far the best turnout we've ever seen at an event like this. And literally, they were sitting with us for 30 minutes saying, our sales reps and our customer success folks saying, can you move this over here? Can you, rather than, well, tell me what the value of sales enablement is, right?
Yeah.
And then they walk out with an iPad, they can show around, they can, they
Right.
can show to their boss or whatever. So we're ramping that up big time. So from
That's
an
really cool.
advertising standpoint, I think you'd appreciate just that, you can't give away iPads to everybody,
Totally.
but to the right customer. And if they actually spend the time to wrap up their content and give it to us in a logical way where they've organized it a little bit, then it's worth it to us, right? Because they've actually, they've invested something at that point.
Right. Well,
Um,
if they go on, right, like it's totally worth the investment. iPad will
right,
be relatively small.
right. And it's pretty funny to watch the switch go off with somebody when you're like, here's your app, it's done, take it
Yeah.
home, start using it. All of a sudden, there's no feeling of, well, this is not as easy as you're saying it is, right? It's obviously it's as easy as you're saying it is because you just gave it to me, right? So it's really cool to watch the effect of this now happening.
What are some of the marketing challenges that you've seen, that this has sort of solved, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, so the biggest thing was just connecting with trying to trying to convince companies to buy something that they don't fully understand and they don't really have attach a problem to it, right? So sales enablement is a term that's been out there for 10 years. If you ask 10 companies what sales enablement was, you'd probably get 12 answers, right?
Hmm.
I mean, it's very different. And so what we were struggling with from a marketing standpoint was educating the market on what sales enablement was. And in our mind, it's insights into how content's being used and what's driving revenue. It's enabling the sales rep to actually leverage the right material in the field, personalized for that meeting, and then ultimately, track all that back to CRM,
Right.
so you can understand what's working.
Hmm.
So we were struggling with that's a pretty progressive version of sales enablement compared to just content management, right, or something like that. And so what this new thing has really shifted is let's not try and convince somebody who hasn't bought from us what sales enablement is in our mind. Let's sell it to them in what it is in their mind, right? So it's really basic content management, a sexy app, some light tie-in maybe to CRM if they're willing to start there, and some training. right? Some training that how they could train their customer or their reps on how to use Mediafly. And then let's spend the next 2 years helping them reach that visionary state, right?
Yeah.
And so all of our marketing now is for the most part focused on how do we get you to take the tiniest little step with us. And then we actually kind of diversify or really kind of split. And we just launched a whole area called Evolve Selling Institute, which essentially is our thought leadership platform.
Gotcha.
And our chief evangelist, Tom Pacello, has a book that he's written on our concept of Evolve Selling. And so we've really kind of gone like this, right? We have super high end. We're not trying to sell you anything here. We're trying to teach you how to leverage, how to sell better,
Right.
using technology. And then over here, super simple, the most basic, risk-free, idiot-proof kind of thing,
Right. And I think you touched on something super important. I feel like it's something that I see across the board with pretty much everyone that I, interview and go on a podcast with, is essentially educating the market on what the actual product is and how to use it and really how it's going to make my life easier as a consumer. Right. And I feel like you can do that at scale, especially with content, whether it's video or blog posts and articles and stuff like that. Is that something that you're currently investing time into so that people can just search, even if it's as high, like high funnel as, what is sales enablement, and like what's been working the best?
Yeah. So it's an interesting one. And I don't know if I have the answer on what's working the best. But what I'd say is we're coming at it from all those angles. So, what is sales enablement is actually one of their best performing blog posts, for instance, right? There's a lot, we're producing so much more content than we did in the past, because I really think, to your point, we really do have to educate people on what sales enablement is. I think in my mind, we're using that to connect with people wherever they are on that sophistication journey.
Right.
And I think less companies than I thought were that far along. Or maybe you might have an individual that's that far along, but the company is not ready to be there, right? And so I think it's a combination of connecting with those people so that if they're thinking that way, we can give them that information.
Right.
But at the same time, when they're ready to bring it back to their organization, how do you bring it back in the most lightweight way possible, right? So like we actually had one of the first customers that signed up for this 100 by 3 campaign was a $1 billion global energy company. And he's passionate about sales enablement. He liked what we have to say. He's buying, he's drinking the Kool-Aid. But he still was like, I don't know. He's like, my board's not asking for this. This is not corporate mandate. So how do I get budget for this? So we just, we gave him the 100 by 3 solution so he can walk around with it for 100 days. And he immediately wrote back saying, this just saved me 3 months of trying to convince people internally of what this is. I can now show them what this is. Right.
So that's just like super validating as far as the tactic that's currently being deployed for giving out that free 100 days.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, but I think to your point is there was one person that connected with the higher vision, but the expectation of him being able to convince a whole bunch of other people without something that's, de-risked,
right.
I think would have been hard.
I completely agree. Now to kind of shift gears here and talk a little bit more about, entrepreneurship and running a business and, more of a personal level of what it's like. What are some of the most challenging things on a personal level as far as, building a business? Like, what is it that you kind of like, you just time after time again, you try to deal with something, whether it's stress, whether it's a relationship, like, having enough time for family and stuff like that. Like, what's the one thing that just kind of like keeps coming up over and over again?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I come from an entrepreneurial family, and my wife is also an executive, and in sales and actually in MarTech. So, so I think it's been kind of fortunate. And then we can come home and talk about, what is your
Everyone
ABM
understands.
campaign? Yeah. So I think it would be a lot harder if that wasn't the case. I think the hardest thing is just being able to find time for, in those moments where there's something really tactical going on that I have to solve, fundraising or a personnel challenge. And so the ability to think strategically and continue to wear that hat when there's also a lot of tactical things you have to deal with, I think has been one of the hardest things over time, and to kind of compartmentalize those.
Right.
So you don't either ignore the tactical things, and it's not that I'm in the weeds in every department, right? But there's always something that bubbles up to me that I have to deal with.
Right.
But being able to think visionary and think out there, and be able to, within a minute, switch that hat and go deal with something that's, a local crisis. I think that's probably the most stressful thing, I think.
And how do you deal with that?
That's a great question. I wish I had a better way of dealing with it. I think a lot of sleepless nights. I think a lot of emails in the middle of the night. I
Yeah.
think I think I've just I've been doing it for so long that there's probably a norm that I've accepted that probably is an unhealthy one.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's probably my best answer, which is I don't think I fully figured it out.
Yeah,
You
not
know,
yet. We'll get there.
I would say one of the things that I think I'm really lucky in is that I sell something that I'm also a consumer of.
Right.
So I think I joke about, sales organizations that we go into typically are using kind of a show up and throw up sales model, right? Where they're just kind of leveraging some big long PowerPoint presentation. And I am a recovering show up and throw up sales guy, right? I feel like, and I love our solution because it helps get me out of that. And
Right.
so I think that's a neat thing. I think if we sold, I don't know, widgets for, something that was not something that I do, I
Hmm.
think it would be hard, right? So I think there is this joy in, I'm also a product guy. So when I see a new feature come out, it's like, I'm going to use that tomorrow in my next
Yeah,
investor pitch, right?
that's
I
awesome.
think that keeps me going.
That's awesome. If you could go back to say day one, right? It's a little bit of a time from now, but if you could go back to day one with everything that you've learned throughout these, I think 13 years, you said, what would you have done differently?
It's a really great question. I would have invested earlier in sales and marketing. I feel like I'm such a product guy. I was a programmer and I was a mechanical engineer, and so and I wasn't confident in my own sales. And so when I started building out a sales organization, I didn't. I don't think I put as much budget there as I should have
Hmm.
faster, right? Because I think what I'm realizing over time is you need more people because some don't make it. And you need to kind of each person you add brings a little bit of a vision, right? That they doing something a little different. And so I think that in marketing, right? I would have invested earlier. I did not appreciate. I just figured, more salespeople, they just go find more business, right? But there really is, some value to driving more leads there. And the last thing was, I added an advisory board recently of kind of key members in areas that I'm not naturally talented in, like
Yeah.
marketing and sales and customer success. And so I brought in absolute pros from the outside, and we actually structured the organization so they have they kind of as a body are kind of the board for my commercial team. And so they have the ability to dictate kind of what we do. And I think empowering that put
Yeah.
some of these decisions in the hands of people. It's my internal expert and then an outside expert, and then me who's not an expert.
Hmm.
And I feel like the combination of that was much better than an internal expert and me,
Right.
because I didn't know how good my idea was or not.
So, I mean, technically, you couldn't necessarily go and do that, say day one when you first started. So, by saying that, would you kind of say that you maybe would have invested in maybe like consultants earlier on or something like that, that kind of like guide you in the right direction, even if they're not going to be part of a board, essentially?
Yeah, and I think so. I think I could have done this early on if I had thought of it. I just well, essentially what I've structured now is some advisors that get a little bit of stock, they get a little bit of cash,
Hmm.
and they contribute they contribute a pretty significant amount of attention to us, right? And it's kind of bursts, right? And so I think early on I would have said, okay, I'm bringing in a sales team. I'm going to bring in an advisor who can be a confidant and kind of a peer or a partner for that sales team
Right.
instead of me, because I just don't know anything about it, right?
Hmm.
And so I think and what I'm finding now is I mentor and I advise a lot of companies that are
That's
in
cool.
startup mode, right?
Yeah.
And so I just it wasn't something I thought of to go find. What I really ended up, my mentors became the folks who were funding the company, which
Mhm.
bring a lot of one kind of expertise there, right?
Yeah.
Um, but in a lot of cases, if it wasn't selling SaaS software, then there was something that I was missing. And
Hmm.
so again, I just feel like I couldn't be the best partner with the internal team
Hmm.
as I can now with his outside folks.
Right.
Um, and I absolutely think I could have done it much earlier. And I think it would have helped. It would have seen around some corners that I just didn't know were out there.
Hmm. Cool. Cool. And what's one thing that you're not very good at as a CEO?
Wow. Wow. There's a lot. So let's see. So I would say, so I'm not a natural CEO in kind of that quick accountability. I think one of the things that took me time for, I think two things: clear communication in terms of what the direction I want to go and what my expectations from people are,
Hmm.
and then accountability around that, right?
Like
Um,
telling them, like expressing that, or what do you?
yeah. So I had this incident happen recently with one of the people in our marketing team where we were on a phone and we were having a conversation, and I thought I described exactly what I wanted, and she heard what she heard, and after about a month we came back and I was like, how come you haven't done these things? And she said, I
Uh-huh.
did exactly what we talked about. What I realized is we just didn't have a framework for how we communicate. So we actually deployed what's called V2MOM. It's Salesforce's kind of management methodology.
Mhm.
And it just created this clarity between me and my leaders. So they know exactly, down to the metric, what am I expecting and how am I going to measure the outcome?
Right.
Right. And then it also allowed me to some degree to get a little bit more out of the weeds in some of these things, saying, as long as you achieve this result, then I don't really care how you got there. Right.
Right. Right.
If you start missing that measure, then I'm going to get involved. Right.
Mhm.
And what we're not perfect at it yet, but I'm essentially creating a framework to navigate something that I'm not good at, right?
Mhm.
Which is, and I kind of, you can probably hear during this interview, I kind of wander when I think.
Yeah.
And so there's certain people that will just kind of, you had asked them that question, they would have come back with an answer that's like this, right?
Mhm.
Um, Whereas I think in my case, I need something to crystallize that,
Right.
and articulate the accountability if it doesn't happen.
Mhm. Very well. And a couple last questions here. What's your favorite book? I realized you named a couple of good ones earlier, so I wanted to see like what's the one that you really enjoy and brought value
Yeah.
to you.
So definitely Jack Walsh's Straight from the Gut would be absolutely my favorite one.
Okay.
It could have been the time when I read it, which is kind of like a lightning strike
Uh,
right at that moment. But that would definitely be the one that I continue to go to.
Sweet. Awesome. And last questions here. Where can people find you online?
So LinkedIn is probably the best for me. So that's by far, that's almost like my second email method.
Hmm.
So that's absolutely the best one.
Got you. Sweet. And last question here, Carson. Do you have any questions for me?
No, I think this was awesome. I think, I probably what I'd love to know how everybody else answers all those other questions that I just asked or you just asked me.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, they're not always the same questions. They're all out there though. It would be pretty hard to, just kind of like
yeah, right.
throw all that up. But yeah, I've had some really awesome people on the show. Definitely a lot of value. So if you ever feel like, you want to learn a little bit from someone specifically, you might find that person on the podcast. This will actually be episode 72. But yeah, I think there's a lot of different answers to a lot of different questions, but overall, very, very valuable information.
Totally. I love hearing particularly people that are humble and honest about what the pros and cons were, how they got there. It's an
Yeah,
awesome.
I think most people are relatively, humble and actually very transparent, which is pretty interesting, and everyone appreciates that. So
Yeah.
you can get some more information on those podcasts.
Cool.
Thank you, Carson, so much for being on here. It was a pleasure. And for anyone that's interested in the sales enablement platform, make sure to check out Mediafly, and you can get those 100 days for $100. And again, thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye bye.